Just a brief introduction, I guess. My name is Brody Staple, currently serving as the president of Edge Dairy Farmer Cooperative. I'm happy to be here. First time at the show here, and our dear friend Michael Crinan invited us out here for the show, and couldn't make it last year. Happy to be here this year. So I dairy back in Wisconsin with my family, right next to Lake Michigan. But here to talk a little bit about Edge. Edge has members throughout the Midwest now, including a growing number here in South Dakota, as you all know. And we are proud to represent them on a federal policy level. We're also proud to be a sponsor for what is sure to be a meaningful and insightful presentation by Mr. Ray Starling. So a little bit about Ray. He was raised on a diversified Century family farm in North Carolina, which laid the foundation for his career in law and agricultural policy. Ray's experiences have taken him from clerking for Supreme Court justices to serving at the highest levels of the government in the White House and the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I hope he tells his red button story today. It's a good one. So Ray attended North Carolina State University for his undergraduate career, while also keeping busy as a national FFA officer. He received his law degree from the University of North Carolina with multiple noteworthy recognitions. Before working his way to serve as general counsel to the North Carolina Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, Ray clerked for the state Supreme Court and practiced law at an international law firm. Ray enjoyed a stint in the North Carolina legislature before heading to Washington, D.C. to serve Senator Thom Tillis as an agricultural policy advisor, chief counsel, and later as the chief of staff. In 2017, Ray became a special assistant to the president for agricultural policy as staff for the National Economic Council at the White House. He left the post in mid-2018 to serve as chief of staff to Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, to help oversee an agency with more than 108,000 employees and a $140 billion annual budget. So Ray recently returned to his home state to serve as general counsel to the North Carolina Chamber of Commerce, while also promoting Starling Farms sausage from his family's farm. Please welcome Ray Starling.
Thank you, Brody. I know that number about USDA employees, that's kind of a big number, 108,000, but don't worry, most of them don't come to work every day, so it really wasn't as hard to manage as you might have imagined. That's supposed to be funny. That's about as good as it's going to get, so feel free to laugh. We're going to try to have a good time today as we talk about this idea of policy, and as I bring a perspective from having grown up in the ag sector and still being closely tied to that, and being on the inside and the underside, if you will, of administration, which I thought was a really catchy title, and then I realized at a dairy conference, there may be people in the room that were actually here for a different kind of presentation, because for you all, underside means something else. We're not going to talk about mastitis or cleanliness or anything like that, although those words would apply to some of what happens in Washington. But with that said, thanks for having me. Thanks to Edge. What a great team, and the folks that have hosted me, and at some point John this afternoon is going to whisk me off to the airport. We've talked about it is the Sioux Falls Airport, so there is risk in getting there too early and looking suspicious. I already feel like I look suspicious because I have a sport coat on. I did have enough sense last night to ask someone, should I wear a tie? And they were like, no tie, Ray. We want this to go well. Do not wear a tie. So it's me again, and I say that because I spoke at an Edge conference in January online. I'm sure most of you all have moved your dairy operations online at this point and probably don't even go into the office much at all anymore. That was also a joke. You are a tough crowd. I know this is like 2/3 through your workday already because most of you got up at 4:30, but still, stay with me here. We'll try to laugh a little bit. I'm going to make some of the same points, but it won't be the crux of the presentation that I made at the Edge presentation in January. We'll revisit a couple of those points. Talk about what I think maybe is next, for better or for worse. And then I'm actually going to ask you some questions. And I'm wondering if I should set this microphone further back so that I don't, maybe that will help. And then, of course, in the end, if we have time, we'll do some question and answer. I bet our tech guy's going, isn't he? He was here earlier. It's fine by me, but I mean, in fact, you may like it better. You may have trouble hearing me, which could actually satisfy you. I'm not sure. So a lot to cover, about 50 slides over the course of the next 50 minutes. As my good friend Andrew McCrae says, I'm going to move through my points much like a fat man through a barbed wire fence. I'm going to hit on all the main points, but get through as quickly as possible. Now look, I know this guy on this next slide, who I had the joy of working for a little over a year. I understand he's not the Secretary of Agriculture anymore. I don't deny the results from the election. And I should mention here also that I admire Secretary Vilsack. He and I had a debate during the Trump-Biden campaigns. I was sort of a spokesman for the Trump campaign. He was clearly a spokesman for the Biden campaign. And we got along extraordinarily civilly. In fact, there was no moment during that debate in which he looked at me and said, "Oh, come on, man," or anything like that. And I didn't lean into the microphone and say, "Wrong," or anything like that. So we got along really well. But I learned a lot from Secretary Drew. And one of the things I learned from him, and I say this at the beginning of all my presentations, there's two sort of old quotes that I like to begin with. One of them is this old quote, which originally he attributed to the Chinese. And then we got into this war, trade skirmish, whatever you want to call it, with the Chinese. And since they steal our intellectual property, he decided he would just steal theirs and quit giving them credit. And apparently, and in Secretary Drew's words, it is, when man has no food, he has one problem. When man has plenty to eat, he has many problems. Taken from this old Chinese proverb. I think that's right. I love that quote. I start with it to say thank you for those of you involved in production agriculture, because we have many problems. Largely because we have plenty of food, which without that we would only have one problem. My next quote actually comes from a gentleman who is, well, let's just say he's no longer with us. He ran for president in 1896. He also ran for president in 1900. He also ran for president in 1904. He lost all three times, even though he was his party's nominee. Don't hold that against him, though, because when he ran in 1896, he was actually only 36 years old. But despite being young, and despite never becoming president, he was, at some point, the Secretary of State, so he and Secretary Perdue were both cabinet members. But he is absolutely considered in American political history to be one of the best speakers, one of the best orators in American political history. And I use this joke too. I say that puts him in a very elite category. He's right in there with people like JFK, Lincoln, Douglas, Dennis Rodman, I mean, all the great orators of our political time. And he said, and you're going to absolutely love this quote, he said, "Burn down your cities and leave your farms, and your cities will spring up again as if by magic. But destroy your farms, and grass will grow in the streets of every city in the country." Unfortunately, like I said, he lost the election, which clearly, with his voice and his ability to write and say things like this, if he had merely tweeted it, he would have probably gotten to be the President of the United States, unless he'd been censored. And then I noticed this other thing. These guys actually look alike, right? I mean, that's just kind of weird. We won't stay there for a second, but I've been talking about these two for a couple years now in these presentations, and only this weekend did I put their pictures side by side and say, that's really weird. So, but the point here is I want to say thank you. American farmers, obviously, I hope you hear that a lot. And American farmers really are a part of the social and moral fabric of our country. And I think there is a hierarchy. Now, I know I'm being taped, so please don't let the pork folks, please don't let my grain folks find out about this. Don't let my tobacco farmers in North Carolina find out about this. But I think if there's an echelon amongst the farmers in terms of respect, those of you that do dairying are at the top of the list. There is something about your image and frankly about your hard work and how you provide that really you guys are the 9s and the 10s on the list of all farmers in terms of respect. So he was very kind to introduce me and talk a little bit about my career. I just want to build my credibility here a little bit. Because some of you may be saying by now, where did they find this guy? He really talks funny. Like I remember checking in at the hotel last night and she wanted to know did I have my credit card, and I was like, yeah, here you go. And I said literally yeah, here you go. And she's like, where are you from? I'm like, hey, I said 3 words. What is the problem here? So I grew up on a farm, worked at a State Department of Agriculture, was the attorney for a State Department of Agriculture in North Carolina. That put me in touch with our state level General Assembly. I was going over to the legislature, doing presentations, answering questions, trying to stop bad things from happening. I became friends with some of the speaker's staff and eventually became his lawyer and his ag person. And then that Speaker of the House decided he was going to run for the United States Senate. His name was Tom Tillis. I followed him to Washington. Some people follow a girl. I followed a senator, went to Washington. And a year into that gig, got to be his chief of staff, and then about a year and a couple months after that's when I got the call from the National Economic Council at the White House, and I had the chance to go over and work for Gary Cohn in the Trump administration. And trust me, I understand, not everybody's a fan of the Trump administration, but I really had an amazing time, and frankly was in the room for some really interesting conversations, and happy to tell you more about those. Was there a little bit over a year, and then went to work with Secretary Perdue at USDA. And finally, after 4.5 years in Washington, I decided that there was nothing in that city that justified me keeping myself and my family there. And so we moved back to North Carolina, partly for family reasons. My mother actually is in failing health, and my dad's not getting any younger, but definitely the pull of trying to be back closer to the family farm was part of the justification for coming home. So I told you, I've got some stories I can tell from that time. I have a few stories that I can't tell at that time. From that time, but just really cool stuff. Riding in the presidential motorcade, riding on Air Force One, briefing the President of the United States in the Oval Office, having meetings in the Roosevelt Room, the Situation Room, writing executive orders, proclamations for the President, and frankly helping settle a lot of fights over what our policy ought to be in certain areas. So I've really been blessed. And you may be looking at this and thinking, wow, he really has a hard time holding a job. I'll add to that. You remember this guy Scaramucci? At the White House, because turnover was so rampant, we actually measured our time in Scaramucci's. And so I'd just like to say I actually made it like 54 Scaramucci's, which was actually really good and above the average, obviously. So a trip down memory lane. Let's talk about what we talked about with the Edge folks back in January. I mentioned what I call the money spigot, and I was worried that at some point it's going to be cut off and the bucket's only going to be half full. I mentioned lawyers and how they, in some instances, threaten the agricultural sector and industry going forward. And I mentioned at that time, because it was about January 21st, 22nd, somewhere along in there, I mentioned the shift that was going to happen at the federal level to the new policymakers, to the folks who had won the election and been sworn in. And I'll talk and unpack that a little bit more here in a moment, too. So to start with, that money spigot, and we're going to fly through this part. Last year, over $45 billion going into your and your colleagues' pockets on the production side of agriculture. This does not even count what went into SNAP or food box programs and things like that that ultimately help aid prices or to buy down product from farmers. This is direct payments to farmers. So this would be your PPP money, it would be CFAP, it would be WIP, it would be TLC and ARC if you're growing grains, it would be your DRP program, loan deficiency payments, any form of your dairy support, and even some MFP still left in there for 2020 in the first 2 or 3 months of the 2020 year. And again, does not include indirect assistance. And there's even been more. There's more that was just done in the American Rescue Plan bill. And I want to show you, and this isn't new, because obviously this only passed in the last couple of weeks, or last month, I guess I should say at this point. John Newton, who is a great economist in-house at the Farm Bureau, I'm stealing his slide here, but giving him credit. And I should also tell you, just yesterday, I think it was yesterday, they announced that John is going to be the economist for the Senate ranking member on the Ag Committee, so he's going to be an economist back in the Senate now. But he laid out where are those dollars going in this last $10 billion that comes to agriculture as a result of the $1.9 trillion relief bill that was passed completely along a partisan line vote through reconciliation. Note the percentages here, because I think it says something about the priorities of the new administration. 39%, this biggest block and by far the most controversial down here in blue, 39% to debt forgiveness for socially disadvantaged farmers. So that is money that is reserved only if you are in the socially disadvantaged class of farmers, and you do not have to show, although the final rules haven't been written yet, but it is Congress's intention that you would not have to show lost revenue from COVID. You do not have to show that you are behind on payments. You do not have to show that you are under stress. If you meet the qualifications of being a, quote, socially disadvantaged farmer, you get your loan paid off. Now, if you don't meet those, guess what? You still owe on your loan and are going to have to keep paying. So that should be interesting to watch and to see if that develops some legal activity, because I'm not exactly sure how under the equal protection provisions of the Constitution you can actually run a program like that, but apparently we're going to give it a try. $4 billion in that piece. Now go around to the left. Food purchase and distribution efforts. I said in January, partly the new administration was going to be about climate change, buying and giving away more food, and the race and equity issues. That's exactly what we're seeing here. Notwithstanding increases in child tax credit payments, notwithstanding an additional $1,400 in your check, in your bank account that you get, and notwithstanding PPP payments and all that kind of good stuff. I was thinking about something for individuals. There's additional food purchase money going over to USDA, $3.6 billion. I was in the room this morning over in the arena, and Phil Plord, I think I'm saying Mr. Plord's name right, mentioned this, $3.6 billion, again, on top of all the food assistance programs we have. Quite frankly, it's going to be hard to spend, folks. Giving away money, buying food and giving away food is actually kind of hard to do, particularly when you're at saturation in terms of how much aid you're offering. So, and by the way, I would mark on this blue dot, on this blue part of the pie here, 3 members of the Democratic Party were asked this week about that program, and I quote, that is a good start. And so I don't think we've seen the end of that kind of maneuvering with the money. I also mentioned in January the lawyers. This is a point I make almost any time when I'm out on the road. I know that in your daily operation, you don't want to have to think about lawyers. But I come from North Carolina, Southeast North Carolina in particular, where plaintiffs' lawyers have sued Big Ag, in our case, pork producers, and it is absolutely changing the face of the industry. These are people that have lived beside each other for decades. Now someone has come in and asked them to sign up as a part of a plaintiff's class action. They are suing for claims like nuisance, trespass, noise, odor, go down the list, and the damages are exorbitant. In some cases, the damages are limited to some real small amount, $1 or $10, but then in most of these cases punitive damages have been allowed, and the jury has granted those. And in that case, essentially what you have is not only a major payout to that plaintiff, that farm is going to close down. An integrator is simply not going to continue to put hogs on a farm that has been the subject and has been on the losing side of a lawsuit. So this is real. This is not sort of thinking about lawyers being a threat. It is a real threat, and in fact, our legislature took specific activities to make it more difficult in North Carolina to sue under nuisance claims. What happened? A year later, the plaintiff's lawyers were back, and they didn't file a nuisance claim. They actually filed an actual trespass claim. And part of the pleading in their complaint, and this got cut off right here because I kind of thought that was funny. Notice here they're saying that dead animal parts enter plaintiff's properties. It must be like one of those, what's that TV show with the dead people? What's it called?
Walking Dead?
Walking Dead, yeah. And we've been through this phase. Maybe we're over it.
Game of Thrones?
Well, not Game of Thrones, but people see these people. Like, they're not vampires. What are they? Zombies. Zombies, yes. Sorry, thank you. Somebody's with it. I'm not. And so I don't know exactly what these animal parts look like when they're coming onto the farm, these dead animal parts coming over. Well, part of what they say are that buzzards pick them out of the kill bins or the dead bins and then fly off with them, and sometimes they drop them on their property. And so then they say that is a trespass. Now, you would think that's happening like all the time, right? That there's like just bones coming out of the sky. It's like some kind of biblical scene or something. But to make a long story short, the judge did not dismiss the case. The case is now going to proceed and go through discovery. And at the end of the day, I'd be surprised if we see much of a different result, partly because of some of the dynamics around those cases. So I still think that's a threat. And then I have to mention, and this is just a lawyer in me, so you don't have to pay attention to this if you don't like lawyering stuff, but there was actually a case at the United States Supreme Court this week, and I felt like I would be tone deaf if I didn't acknowledge it. It was argued on Monday, and the case is about, out of California, whether a farmer, or farmers generally, have to be compensated by the union who comes onto the farm under an older law out of California that says union representatives get to come on your farm to ask your employees how they're doing and to see if they want to organize or to kind of check in with them. So the Pacific Legal Foundation is representing a group of farmers out of California and says that's a taking. That is government taking part of my property. That is coming, it's not a search and seizure issue because it's a private party. It's a taking issue is the way they framed it. And they are literally asking the United States Supreme Court to declare that the state of California, by giving union representatives a right to come on the farm, have given that union an easement on that farmer's property. And that would mean that they have to be compensated for that. I will tell you, Pacific Legal Foundation has had 11 of these kinds of cases, property right cases, before the Supreme Court. They have won 9 of them, which is remarkable for a nonprofit law center. So the odds are in their favor. However, I will tell you the justices were very skeptical in their questions on Monday, and I think they would be loath to create a new kind of taking, an easement taking, but they may send the case back to the lower court and say, don't you think you can fit it into some of the constructs that we've already developed? So, we'll watch that case, we'll watch the lawyers, you know how those darn lawyers can be. And then I mentioned this federal shift, and I've already made these points, I'll only stay here a second. But this was our trip down memory lane, that what you can expect in terms of the big buckets out of this administration is up here on the board. So, if that was not good enough, it's kind of like these 2 cows, and they're saying, hey, if we make it over the fence, he's still got a rifle, and there's still a border collie. What are you going to do about them? So you may be sitting there now thinking, is there any more good news? What else could we possibly hear from this weird-talking guy from Southeast North Carolina? Any more good news? Well, here's a preview of how I want to spend the rest of our time today. Talking about, I just don't think you can have a conversation about the policy environment today without still talking about COVID. I know you've heard about COVID, you're tired of hearing about COVID, but it's absolutely going to have indelible imprints on our future. Politics, admit it, that's why you're here. You say you don't like it, but it's kind of fun to talk about. And then finally, where are we as a country? I think there's actually the beginnings of a conversation here, and this is where you can kick me out. This is my philosophy piece, not my policy background. But to make a long story short, I'm going to sort of close and ask you some questions about where we are and where you think we might be going. Agriculture does not, as you well know, happen in a vacuum, and certainly agricultural policy doesn't happen in a vacuum. We don't just work on our farms, do a good job, and think the rest of the world is going to take care of itself. Our production world is now inextricably linked with how these other things happen, how politics happen, how trade policy happens, how consumers react, and certainly, again, how traumatic sort of shocks to the system like COVID impact our industry. So let's talk about COVID. First, we're going to talk about the numbers, and we're going to talk about the COVID economy. Some of this is actually similar to what the gentleman spoke about at 11 a.m. And we're going to talk about this theory with regard to COVID, which I think you'll agree at the end, if not at the beginning, has happened or is true. And that theory is that for trends that were already happening in society and certainly in the economic world, in the business world, those trends, if they were trending forward in a positive direction, that trend accelerated. And if there were trends that were trending in a negative direction, those trends equally accelerated in that negative direction. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll, of course, talk about what I said earlier, that lasting fingerprint or thumbprint or imprint that COVID is going to leave on the generations that have now lived through it. Raw numbers, I just over the course of the last year, 539,000 deaths. And now we're up to 124 million doses of the vaccine actually already in people's arms, which is why we can have meetings like this one now. This is remarkable and is a story untold because at this very time last year, in fact, on March 19th, 2020, the Washington Post had a very comprehensive article, essentially with the headline, how bad is it going to get? What's it going to be like? And they had 2 predictions. That if we don't do much of anything, it's going to be 2.2 million people that die. And that if we take drastic steps, even bigger than the ones we've actually taken across the United States, maybe we'll reduce the number of deaths over the next year to 1.1 million. Now, thanks be to God, those prognostications were a pretty good far ways off, right? I mean, again, thank goodness. And I also don't want you to get the idea that I'm overlooking the seriousness of this numbers. In fact, you've been sitting there a few minutes. I'm going to ask you to participate here. I'm going to ask you a question. I want everybody to start with your hands down, but I'm going to ask you how many of you have been touched in your life and your family somehow by someone who has passed because of COVID, someone who has actually passed away because of COVID. So start with your hands down. Raise your hand if, because of COVID, you have lost a family member to COVID. Anybody here? At least one, two. Keep them up. Keep them up, please. Then extend that to your extended family, your loose family, the people you don't really like to claim, your colleagues and your friends. Anybody lost extended family, colleagues, friends? More hands going up. And then just anybody you know. As someone knows someone that died of COVID. That's pretty remarkable, right? The fact that so many people in this room have been touched by this. But the good news is we're trending in the right direction. This is somewhat morbidly the death count, if you will, and we're over here. This was a screenshot from CDC data on Sunday night, so it's probably actually come down a little bit more since then, or there might have been a little bump on Monday because some of the weekend data lags coming in. But 777 deaths nationwide on March 20th. What a difference a month makes. Back in this area, we were talking about multiples of thousands, 4,000 and 5,000 people a day. So CDC is obviously forecasting that this number is going to continue to get better, and that's what we want to hear. I mentioned the vaccination stuff, 156 doses actually delivered, and 124 million of those already in arms. That number is probably up 2 or 3 or 4 million since, again, Sunday night when I pulled down this particular set of data. This is an untold story, in my view, about COVID, and it impacts us. And it is that early on, some of the talking heads said that rural America was actually positioned to do better in COVID than urban America, largely because of our spacing, right? We are more spaced out and transmission would be slower. This, to me, is disappointing then, that in non-metro areas, and of course that's defined very carefully, and this is actually at USDA data, and it's a little bit old, I mean it's a month old at this point, but the actual deaths per capita are higher in rural America than they are in urban America. Just another place where we can put down a marker and point out that rural America continues to need the attention of our lawmakers and our leaders. Probably some of this is attributed to the fact that our health, our shape and our general health comes in rural America also lag behind urban America in most cases. And also, obviously, the healthcare system is not as robust in rural areas simply because it's a law of numbers, right? There's not as many resources there. But to brighten things back up a second, the economy. Took this screenshot over the weekend. If you wanted to make 340,000 out of 200,000, it would have been a good idea to put that 200,000 in the Dow about this time last year. I mean, these are remarkable numbers. The market up 70% a year. If you were into the tech stocks, up 92% in a year. This reminds me of that old joke about that farmers pass around. I know you've heard it. How do you make $1 million farming? And then someone says you start with $2 million, right? It's never us that gets 70% returns or 90% returns. This is almost as good as dairy farming, but not nearly as fun, 70% returns. That was also a joke. So, winners and losers. You've seen this kind of tape before, but we're going to extrapolate a little bit from this. Obviously, losers in the travel and hospitality sector. Although I don't think they learned anything. I sat on airplanes yesterday, too, and American packed us in just as close as they could. So if you don't think it's still about the bottom line dollar there, think again. Food service, malls, movie venues, many of them, it's sort of the thing that drove them on down into the ground. On the winner side, what I would point out about this slide is it's tech, and then with the exception of housing, it's also tech and tech and tech. So like the food delivery service, in fact the speaker said this morning, a lot of that shift there was technology dependent. You still had the same kitchen, right? You had to box up the stuff, maybe you're cooking something a little bit different or preparing it a different way. But if you don't have a platform that allows folks with iPhones to easily read your menu, to easily place your order, and then to text you back and say, oh, somebody's making it in the kitchen and it'll be ready for you in another 5 or 10 minutes, or it's on the way. All of that is technology stuff that was win, win, win. Streaming services, obviously, and we saw in rural America a vulnerability we had, which was lack of broadband or lack of ability to actually access some of these streaming services. So what didn't change? We'll start with that, and then we're going to say what did change specifically for agriculture. We're going to unpack each of these a little bit more with a visual here in a second. But the price rally in grains, and even last year toward the end of the year in the protein sector a little bit, wasn't necessarily singularly attributable to the recovery from COVID. In fact, some of our worst months of COVID were December, January, February, right? But to a world supply and demand problem. And so I point out here, our market is still the world market. That is where we get our price discrepancies from. What is the world going to consume? What do stocks look like? You're all sort of secretly crossing your fingers if you're in that grain world that Brazil is not going to have a good year. Too much rain, too dry, you get it. So for the bigs, the world is still our market. We grow far more than we can consume all here. Next, labor supply, still a challenge. This is going to be an increasingly limiting factor in our competitiveness around the world. We're going to talk about that here in a little bit, in another minute. It's really gone from a worry to what I would call an acute pinch point in terms of solving our labor crisis issue. I saw on the Edge policy priorities this morning. It is the #1 item on the list, and I certainly understand that's exactly where it needs to be. Remember $8 corn a few years ago? We really have the ability in agriculture to outdo ourselves pretty fast. So we can take these high prices, plant fence row to fence row, and we can bring them down pretty quick. So that didn't change. And then the channel changes, which impacted some folks more than others, right? The fact that we went more into retail and food service, and really for some of us farmers in the ag community, if you don't control that final point of sale, you're really at the mercy of some of these market forces. So let's talk about each of those. First, the export piece. What didn't change? The world is still our market. That's why I think we can actually feel relatively optimistic. This is total exports, and then it's broken up into commodity group. And look at that jump from 2020 to 2021. As world economy recovers a little bit, as we work through some of these logistical issues out at the ports and off the coast, we should have a good year in 2021 in terms of exports. I would have thought that the red part of this bar chart at the top, the livestock, dairy, and poultry, that's where you are, I would have actually thought that was going to grow more drastically. But then again, a good economist down at Texas A&M that I think a lot of, Joe Outlaw, he talks about how we as Aggies, we like to get in the room and say, oh, if we could just get exports up 1 or 2%, 1 or 2% every year, we'd be good to go. He says we've been saying that for 20 years, because what happens? We sell 1 or 2% more, and then you guys go out and make 1 or 2% more. That's how efficient, how amazing, and how productive, capable you are. But still, if you look at that run from 2020 to 2030, going from 137 billion to 180 billion, that really is a pretty big jump in exports in just a matter of 9 years. Labor. And this is where we can really talk turkey. I use this slide because there are still those on both sides of the political aisle, and quite frankly, more on the Republican side than on the Democratic side, that say, well, why don't you just hire Americans? It's a good thing we don't have concealed carry here in the place, because if someone says that to me one more time, I would be very tempted. You know what I mean? Because these folks who have left the labor force in March of 2020 are not coming to agriculture. We have never seen in the course of the last 20 to 25 years, despite spikes in unemployment, and not just spikes, but despite sustained unemployment in the 08 through the 14 years, if you will, we simply do not see domestic laborers, American workers, if you will, going back to agriculture. And so the point I make here is, I think this, of all the unemployment data that is very confusing to look at, to me the most important thing to look at is, of the people that want to work, or are looking to work, or have been working, how many of those are actually still out of work? In the United States, of the working age population, which is 15 to 64 years old, about the highest we got at the end of the Trump administration years was 63.3% labor force participation rate. Meaning that out of that group of working age people, 63.3% of them were working or actively looking for work. Now look where that number is. You might think that that difference in percentage, that 2% there, which actually equates to about 4 million workers, would mean we're going to get more people knocking on the door that want to learn how to milk cows. Actually, no, we don't think that at all. So I just point that out, that situation is there even post-COVID, and I suspect as long as we keep mailing out checks, that's not going to get any better. I'm not going to go deep into this, largely because I sat in that 11 o'clock session and I thought the other speaker did such a nice job of it. But it is worth mentioning that this red line here, in terms of thinking about that channel change for food in America, that in 2020, the great grocery store craze just went nuts. So this is total percent of money spent on food that's brought home versus food, what we would call food service, food you would get that's already prepared. And that number has been historically, particularly in good economic times, pretty close to 50-50. And you saw that one of the questions I'm going to ask you is the great grocery grab of 2020 really over? Are we going to go back to restaurants? Or did we have fun hanging out in our kitchen and cooking things and then washing dishes and then thinking about the next meal and which you can tell which side of that I'm on. But the one point I would make here is that there were a few winners in this process. I mean, in the retail sector, everybody consumed more in every category, right? Because more people were going to the grocery store than going to the restaurants. But who won the biggest? And if you look at the largest or the tallest bar charts here, dairy's increase actually did quite well. Meats, eggs, nuts, that kind of makes sense. Although I think that's fascinating, and we can talk about that at a different time. But the meat strength, the strength in the domestic meat market has been fun to watch, right? Because somewhere there's a governor telling people certain days a week you shouldn't eat meat. Are any of y'all from that state? Wasn't that the guy in Colorado? I mean, that was a freebie, right? I had to throw that in. I knew you would all agree with me on that one. And so anyway, it's been fun to watch the meat market actually go up in terms of domestic consumption. And then vegetables, that's kind of interesting. I guess people wanted, started adding that salad or started maybe eating a little healthier once the pandemic set in. My proposal to you, and I do not even want a royalty for this, I just want some of it. Can you imagine if you guys actually teamed up here with alcohol and dairy, put those two together, right? I mean, we've heard about those alcoholic caffeinated beverages. I don't know, maybe alcoholic milk is the next great thing. If it is, you heard it here first, and I won't even charge you for that. So, a lot of things didn't change, a lot of things did change. Consumers preparing food at home more, obviously. I think one of the grocery store things that's been interesting to watch is there were a lot of people looking for those store brands, the less expensive food early on. But frankly, there's a dichotomy in the purchases in the grocery stores. There are folks buying the store brands, the less expensive, and then there are folks buying the premium brands. And so it's actually kind of the middle that's disappearing in the grocery store. And then the last thing I would say, and I've got 2 slides for this over in just a second, is that Americans are thinking more about their health. Let's just fly by this one. And this is, the Hartman Group is a group that does consumer-based research for the food industry up in the northwest part of the United States. And essentially, when you're close to half of your consumers saying they're eating healthier this year than they were last year, that's going to have impacts in the market, right? That's going to mean something for us in terms of what we're selling and what we're able to unload. So, specifically for agriculture and COVID, so we're almost done with that first third of the presentation about COVID, and then we're going to get into the politics in a second. Channel changes came quick. Will they last? I'm going to ask you that question in a minute. What aid will the industry need going forward? Remember, we got the PPP money, we got the food boxes, we've now got this socially disadvantaged assistance. What else is going to come out of COVID? What will COVID be an excuse for writing a check for? And then the consumer focus on health is heightened. I would argue that is a huge opportunity for the people sitting in this room, not a liability at all. So, moving to politics. Again, this is what we're here for. The first thing I would tell you is, despite what you hear, despite what you read, despite what you're thinking, it's actually a lot closer than you think. I'll show you why. We're going to talk about dumbbells and barbells, because obviously looking at my physique, you're probably going to know what I do to work out, so it actually has nothing to do with that. The filibuster, a couple of Aggie-specific topics, and then just brush quickly on the 2020 midterms and what may happen there. So, politics. If I haven't offended you yet, there is still time. Sharpen your pencils. Watching the dust settle.